All right, so it looks like we're all done with introductions. We should get started. Remember to keep yourself muted until you have a question at the end where we're going to have a question and answer section. We are recording this, so you'll have access to it in the future. And we'll go to Sarah.
All right. Hey, everyone. So let me just start off by saying how excited we are to have so many businesses in Idaho interested in exploring the opportunities of exporting. If you attended any of the previous sessions, then welcome back. And if you are new, I'm Sarah Mata. I'm with the Idaho State Department of Agriculture as a trade specialist.
Thanks. And again, my name is Sharon Adams. I'm with the Idaho Department of Commerce on the international team. Both our teams work with small to medium-sized Idaho companies that are new to exporting or are trying to expand their export business.
Our goal in this session is going to be to help you to understand the benefits of an export compliance program, gain knowledge of export financing and banking, determine how to navigate international laws and regulations. We'll have two guest speakers today. We have Natalie Sullivan with Banner Bank to discuss export financing and banking, and we have Dave Glenn of Holland Hart to help with the navigating of international laws and regulations. Before they start to present, though, Sharon and I will go over a few things that you should know about developing an export compliance plan.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. So just to talk a little bit about what an export compliance program can do, one of the more important things your compliance program should have is safeguards throughout your entire supply chain process. This will help ensure consistent decisions, reliable processing, and thorough due diligence. A good program will also serve as a way to communicate red flags and questions about the legitimacy of a customer or a transaction. It will protect your employees through training and awareness and help avoid violations. Although an export compliance program is an invaluable way to protect your company's interests, it is not a guarantee that export violation will not occur. It does minimize the risk and can be your map to consistently staying in compliance. Before you begin developing a program, take stock of what you already have and get organized. Keep in mind, this is just the tip of the iceberg today. We'll barely be scratching the surface on compliance. You will need to do your research and determine the licensing required for your particular products. You want to educate yourself and establish a compliance program that you can stick with, or you want to have a third party help you create your compliance program for you and follow it with updates and audits. So there is a worksheet that we sent out yesterday that would be helpful if you wanted to pull that out now, the one titled Export Compliance. There's also a link to the BIS Compliance Guideline book on this slide. It's a much deeper dive than we have time for in this training series, but it's a great resource when you start developing your own export compliance program.
Senior management commitment is going to be one of the most important factors in success of any export compliance program. It's a good idea to draft a management commitment statement as part of your plan. That management commitment statement should affirm the company's commitment to export compliance, explain the basic purpose of export controls, state that no sale will be made that violates or even potentially violates regulations and laws, stress the importance to employees of any possible non-compliance scenarios, communicate the risk of unauthorized transfers, and describe the possible penalties for non-compliance, such as the loss of export privileges, disciplinary action by the company, damage to individual and company reputation, and even criminal penalties. Lastly, it should always include the name and the contact information of the export compliance manager.
When we go to number 2 for risk assessment, many companies fail to identify their risks early on and focus solely on getting orders out the door. This can create vulnerabilities in the compliance program and then require much more work later to correct it. We encourage you to start early and invest in a compliance program that continually assesses your risks. You can see on the slide here some of the more common risks: exporting without a license, release of sensitive information or controlled technology, lack of communication within the organization, poor relationships with export facilitators, not having adequate export clearance procedures in place, unknown end user or end use, So knowing your risks up front is a great way to stay on top of potential compliance issues.
When it comes to authorization, the things you need to ask are, which agency has jurisdiction over my exported items? Is my item subject to any additional regulations? What is the correct classification for my items? How does my organization determine if an item requires a licensed export? And what screening processes does my company have to prevent it from violating general prohibitions? So think about the approval process that you will implement to ensure that all compliance measures have been performed prior to the export. It's also important to note that licenses are going to differ depending on your product. For example, an ag company will have much different regulations than, say, an arms and ammo company. And it's important to know your specific product regulations and requirements.
Number 4 is record keeping. Always everyone's favorite. I know it's mine. Some common issues companies are faced with regarding record keeping are poor development, poor support, and poor execution. Poor development would not be having a complete compliance program in place or not using the program you do have. Support would take some resources that could be in the form of time to educate your staff or money for training and time to follow through with that. Execution would be waiting until you have an issue to adopt a compliance program or no follow-up or audit processes when you have a compliance program in place. There are some documents that may not be required by regulation to be kept, but sometimes it's in your best interest to maintain those. As a reference, there's record keeping requirements with the export administration regulations. It can be found at the link on this slide, and that will help you with questions like, how long do I keep records? What type of records are required to be kept? How to reproduce documents if required, and which documents are exempted from retention.
Along with record keeping, training is another very important part of an export compliance program. A good training program is critical to having an effective program. In designing your program, look to tailor the message as specifically as possible to help the various staff members understand their role and how they need to contribute. A good training program should communicate the export responsibilities for each employee, and depending on the knowledge and the skills needed to perform that job, employees should receive different levels of export control training. So you'll see this pyramid here. At the bottom of the pyramid, the training is aimed at teaching the basics of export controls. Generally, this is provided to all employees and is given as a basic refresher course to those with little or no exposure to exports. And then in the next level, we have positions with export roles. This might include folks involved in the shipping and the receiving, human resources, sales staff, and among others. At the very top of the pyramid will be the export compliance manager or company owner and his or her supporting staff. So this group should receive training on all export control regulations that would impact the organization's exporting activities. This could possibly require training on regulatory requirements that are related to imports, re-exports, and transfers after an export has occurred. It's also a good idea to include training for potential future needs that may be necessary for the organization so that you're always forward-leaning and can plan ahead.
Number 6 goes into audits. There are basically 3 types of audits. The first is a specific unit or functional level audit. This type looks at specific areas such as record keeping, shipping procedures. These assessments can be done on a more frequent basis than a program level audit as they focus on one item or a smaller area at a time. Most importantly, these specific functional level audits can focus attention at an early stage, giving your company the opportunity to correct vulnerabilities before they develop into bigger problems. A program level audit should be conducted at least on an annual basis and should include a review of the export procedures as well as reviewing selected transactions. Some examples of items that should be reviewed in this type of audit are your internal controls for compliance, processes for authorizing or clearing your exports, corrective actions and follow-up procedures, review of your record-keeping practices. The third one would be using an external auditor. If the resources allow with your company, this third type of audit is a good business practice to periodically utilize External audits can provide an unbiased third-party evaluation of your overall export compliance program and practice and help keep you out of being non-compliant.
Export violations and corrective actions. So an essential part of a compliance program are going to be your procedures, of which provide clear guidance to all your employees concerning what actions to take in the event of a suspected incidence of non-compliance. An early detection program for identifying suspected incidences of non-compliance should include detect and act early. The earlier that you can detect and act on potential violations, always the better. Support from senior management. Employees should be encouraged to report suspected export violations. Management should also ensure that employees have adequate training, knowledge, and resources to comply with the program. You should create a safe environment. Employees should have a high level of assurance that compliance is management's overriding concern in all export decisions and will never be sacrificed for profit or personal gain, as well as employees should know that they'll be free from retaliation or retribution. You should encourage your employees to report. It should be a part of all their performance plans and evaluations, stating that employees are expected to raise concerns when they see a possible problem. It's an employee's duty to speak up if they're unsure about the proper course of action. And then internal and external reporting procedures. So all staff should be given clear instructions on how suspected incidences of noncompliance should be reported. Written procedures should be developed and included in your compliance program. Submitting a voluntary self-disclosure. So when a non-compliance is confirmed, written procedures should be developed for external reporting processes to the U.S. government. The Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security has a voluntary self-disclosure program. It's important to note that in order to be considered voluntary, disclosures must be made prior to the governing agency gaining knowledge of the potential non-compliance. So the overall lesson here is to disclose as quickly as possible. And corrective actions. Once non-compliance is confirmed, then the compliance team will need to develop corrective actions to ensure that the non-compliance does not reoccur. These corrective actions should be implemented as quickly as possible and then monitored to ensure that they are working properly. Include in your self-disclosure what corrective actions have been taken to help avoid any reoccurrence. And again, early detection and fast responses to resolve the non-compliance issue is the key to minimizing your organization's exposure.
Sarah, can I chime in for just a second on that?
Yeah.
Sarah Massey, S. Massey Consulting again. Just wanted to make a note on the voluntary self-disclosure that in addition to it needing to be done prior to the government knowing about it, you also need to have management involved in it, because if management isn't involved in it, then it's also not determined to be a self-disclosure. So an employee can detect it, but management has to get involved when they report it.
Good information, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Sarah. So number 8, building your export compliance manual. Getting started. So understand the benefits of an export compliance manual, such as protection against unintended violations, fines, disruptions in business, and damage to your reputation. A written export compliance manual will help your employees know their specific responsibilities and help to speed export processes and delivery of your products and services to customers. When you're ready to write it, depending on the size of your organization and the extent of your export operations, your written manual could range from a dozen or so pages to 100 or more. The most important aspect here is to keep it relevant to your needs. Make sure the manual is easy to understand and captures the day-to-day operations and procedures. Examine your risk and identify those in your risk assessment section and include the personnel responsible for export compliance. Keep in mind that creating this written compliance manual will most likely take several months to complete, especially if you're doing it on your own as a small company. When you go to publish your manual, you want to have an official corporate look. So take time to ensure the overall appearance shows the importance of this document. Make sure your management commitment statement includes who is the contact person for staff if they have any questions or feedback on the manual. Make a calendar assignment to do periodic reviews of the manual to ensure it's kept up to date, and make edits as needed when export regulation changes occur.
On this slide, we just have some references that we refer to in a couple of the slides, as well as some other sources that will be really beneficial to you as you begin to kind of develop that export plan compliance.
Perfect. So now we're going to turn it over to Natalie Sullivan with Banner Bank to talk about export financing. There's another worksheet that we created if you guys want to pull that out now, the internal trade payment methods. We'll let you get going, Natalie.
Thank you so much. You guys can hear me, right? Got myself off mute. Yes.
Yep.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me. Again, I'm Natalie Sullivan. Banner Bank is either a small regional bank or a large community bank located on the West Coast. We are in Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and California. And our bank, and especially our department, works with small and medium-sized companies. Some have been exporting for years, and some are just kind of dipping their toe in the export water. So we see a lot of variety. We don't have a lot of time here today, only about 20 minutes to talk about trade finance. So we're going to move pretty quickly. But some of the things that we'll talk about are the primary payment methods, how to manage some of the risks associated with those methods, how you might consider choosing a payment method, and also ways to access financing or otherwise manage your cash flow. May I have the next slide? So here is a graphic that shows the four main payment mechanisms. We have cash in advance, that's your wire transfers predominantly, although if you're like an e-commerce business, maybe credit cards. Letters of credit, documentary collections, and open account, also done on wire transfer basis typically. I think these days about 80% of business is done on either cash in advance or open account, and so letters of credit and documentary collections make up that other 20. I want you to pay kind of attention to how the chart shows most secure and least secure, and notice that what is most secure for the exporter, cash in advance, is least secure for the importer. So as you're building your strategy, remember that, and today we're going to talk mostly from the export perspective, but your buyer, the importer on the other side, is also managing the opposite risks. So when you're considering a payment method, think about this. Also, it's really important that you think about the relationship you have with your buyer, the nature of the product that you're selling, its perishability, but also is it specialized for that particular buyer or the industry, or is it something that's easily sellable elsewhere? You might have to consider common industry practices. You might have to consider your financing or your buyer's financing. It's really important that you consider how you're shipping, like your Incoterms. I think you touched on that in a previous session. And then also country practices and currency controls that countries might have all come into play here with which method you might choose. Most companies that we work with, they have a credit policy that's different for every customer. So it might have to do with whether it's a distributor or a one-time buyer or the country that they're in, but one method will not work for all of your buyers. Next slide. So diving in, some of the things we're going to talk about today are letters of credit, both commercial and standby, documentary collections, foreign currency forward contracts, and credit insurance. Next slide. So letters of credit. There's two main kinds of letters of credit that are out there. Typically, when we're talking about international business, we're talking about commercial letters of credit. I am going to talk about standbys in just a minute. But a commercial letter of credit is a payment mechanism where the buyer or importer, in this instance, goes to their bank and asks their bank to issue an irrevocable promise of payment, providing that the exporter provides certain documentation within a certain time frame, in which case the bank is obligated to pay. So I'll say that one more time. The buyer's bank issues an irrevocable promise to pay in exchange for when documents are presented within a given time frame. So all of those details are set out in the letter of credit. Most letters of credit are done on a site basis, which is just a way of saying when you present documents, payment is due right away. But you can also give terms to buyers through letters of credit, and we call those usance letters of credit. But a usance letter of credit just means that when the bank accepts receives the documents and they comply, then they'll pay in 30, 60, 90 days. Benefits to the seller. Letters of credit are really there to protect the seller. So it transfers the risk of non-payment from the buyer to the buyer's bank. And if you aren't comfortable with the risk of the buyer's bank, you can go one step further and try to find a bank in the US that will confirm the letter of credit. So a lot of people have heard the term irrevocable and confirmed letter of credit, but you don't have to confirm them. And payment is made if your documents comply with the terms of letter of credit. And if you wrote the letter of credit correctly, it mirrors the contract. So you've proved that you've held up your end of the bargain and payment is due. And it's because of this, it also typically speeds up the payment. There's not a lot of waiting for 30, 60, 90 days for money to come. Now, taking a step back and looking at your buyer's side, for the buyer, it does encourages the seller to ship without prepayment. There's typically not an advance payment, although those can be part of a letter of credit if you would like. And the buyer doesn't have to lay out any cash until the item is actually shipped. Now, a lot of people find letters of credit frustrating. And usually the reason that they are frustrated is they put together their documents, they've worked really hard, and they take them into their bank and they're discrepant. So the primary way that we encourage our clients to minimize discrepancies or mistakes in the documents that don't guarantee payment is to ask for a draft of the letter of credit before it's actually issued. Your buyers can do this, and banks will send them over. And to review the letter of credit, make sure you understand everything that's expected of you, and make sure that you can actually comply and produce the documents required and ship your product in the time frame required under the letter of credit. Let's see, next slide, please. So standby letters of credit. Whereas a commercial letter of credit is the payment mechanism, a standby letter of credit we can think of more as an insurance policy. Typically, they are domestic in nature, but they don't have to be. They can be used for international business. They're just a backup. So typically, let's say you're selling to a buyer on open account terms. So like on the common list, common uses list, it says support unpaid invoices. Let's say you're an exporter and you are going to ship to a buyer once a month $100,000 worth of merchandise. Well, they can issue a $100,000 letter of credit that's there all year, and you ship and get paid, ship and get paid, ship and get paid as many times during that time frame as you can. That letter of credit is out there, so if they don't pay you, you can draw on it, but otherwise you can presume with an open account sale. Another way that we see this used in international business is when our clients are getting a large deposit for maybe a specialized piece of equipment. They'll get a deposit, but then they're required to send back an advance pay standby letter of credit, or in some countries they don't use standbys. They're called bank guarantees, but they operate very similarly. And so you as an exporter, if you receive a deposit, might be required to issue one of these. They can also be used for contract performance. They can be used to support a warranty. So again, let's say you've sold a piece of equipment that has a 2 or 3 year warranty on it. The exporter can issue the letter of credit to the buyer that's maybe 5 or 10% of the contract value, and it's out for whatever the period is, let's say 2 to 3 years. Letters of credit can also be used for bid bonds, and then very common domestically is for a rent or lease guarantee in case a company defaults on their payments. Next slide. So documentary collections. For a letter of credit, the bank is obligated to pay when documents are presented. Documentary collection, the bank is more a collection agency. So you, the exporter, ship, you collect your documents, you give them to your bank sends them over to the foreign bank, and the foreign bank says, hey buyer, I've got the documents for your shipment. If you would like them, please pay. So most documentary collections are done documents against payment. Buyer pays their bank gives them the documents, Those documents generally include things like the ocean bill of lading, which then allows the buyer to go down to the port and pick up the freight. These are much less expensive and much, much easier than letters of credit, but they do not have any guarantee of payment. It's possible that the buyer may decide they don't want the product after all, and then they just don't bother to pay and go down and pick it up. That has not happened in my experience, but it certainly can. So again, it comes back to what's the relationship with your buyer, and is that something that you're comfortable with? Next slide. Foreign currency forward contracts. Show of hands, I only see a few faces. Does anybody sell in anything other than US dollars? Or have clients that sell in anything other than US dollars? No. So sometimes companies feel like they can be more competitive if they're willing to sell in whatever the foreign currency is. Our clients have done recently Canadian dollars and euros. We've done some Japanese yen. However, the world is risky and markets are constantly changing. This last year, case in point. And so for some businesses, if they quote a contract or an invoice in a foreign currency, they've got a lot of risk because they don't know what the exchange rate is going to be when they're actually going to get paid or perhaps have to make a payment. So a foreign exchange forward contract allows you to lock in the currency rate today for what you will either get paid or have to pay 3 to 6 months in the future. There's kind of two flavors of this. We call it an open or window forward. It means you're going to get the payment within a small window of time, or a closed forward, which means you're going to receive funds on a specific day. I do have to say here that forward contracts do have some specific requirements, not from the banks, but from regulating agencies, that companies have to meet certain thresholds before they can participate. But if that's something that you're ever interested, I highly recommend talking to your bank about it and seeing if you qualify, because it's a great planning tool for the future. Next slide, please. Credit insurance. Now, Trish McCarthy from Impello Global is going to talk a little bit about this, but a lot of companies find themselves in places where they need to give open account terms, or their industry requires it, or they're trying to be competitive. But companies don't give terms for two reasons, primarily. One, the risk of non-payment is too high and they can't afford it. Or two, if you gave all your clients open account terms, you would have no cash with which to run your business. So export credit insurance provides you with protection against the risk of non-payment. It is an insurance policy on your accounts receivable, if I didn't say that already. And it covers you for political, typically, and commercial reasons. So buyer goes out of business, buyer says the check is in the mail, but it never comes. Or for political reasons, they're no longer allowed to pay you. You can claim under your insurance policy. There's lots and lots of details that it depends on your business, but you can get single or multi-buyer policies. The other financing benefit of credit insurance is if you're a business who has a line of credit at a bank, you might have part of your line is based on the number of receivables that you have that you can borrow against. Most banks will exclude foreign receivables from your borrowing base, or they'll let you borrow very, very little. If you have credit insurance, a lot of banks will add those receivables back in and maybe give you anywhere between a 50 to 80% perhaps advance rate on those receivables so that you can access cash to continue financing your business. Credit insurance is not offered by banks, it's offered by insurance companies. So there are private insurance companies. Ex-Im Bank also has their own insurance program, which is administered through brokers. And I think the primary way our clients tend to get insurance is through specialized credit insurance brokers. They have the ability to take a look at your business and look at the whole market and really help match you up appropriately. Next slide, please. The Trade Finance Guide. Sharon did not encourage me to put this in necessarily. We give this to everybody. But the Trade Finance Guide from the U.S. Department of Commerce is fantastic. It lays out all the payment mechanisms in very succinctly and clear manner. It gives some pros and cons. It also talks about some of the financing available. I can't recommend it enough. We generally have our clients take a look at it. Next slide. Some other websites with good information is the International Chamber of Commerce, or the ICC. If nothing else, it's a great cure for insomnia, but it's got some good info, especially in letters of credit. And then both the Small Business Administration and Export-Import Bank have great websites with information for exporters, as well as both SBA and Ex-Im Bank have working capital loan programs. So if you can't get to help fill export orders from your bank, ask them if they participate in these programs. A lot of the banks that are SBA lenders will participate at least in SBA side and often Ex-Im. The programs are a little bit different, but both of them exist to help you finance export sales. And then next slide. If nothing else, find somebody who is an expert in trade finance and international payments, and really make sure that you're getting the help that you need. It's very sad to me when companies pass on international business just because they can't figure out the payment side. Sometimes you have to walk away anyway, but it's a shame. And there's a lot of ways to really be competitive internationally, especially on the payment side, but also make sure that your business is secured in a way that makes you comfortable. At the end of the day, the money is actually coming in for the product that you're selling. And then next slide. So thank you for having me today. If you'll go one more slide, please. Thank you. Here's my contact info, and I'm actually filling in today for a colleague who's in Boise. I'm in Seattle, but my colleague Kristen is actually located in your area. You're welcome to call any of us. There's no pressure to be a Banner Bank client by any means. We love talking about trade finance, happy to be a resource and bounce ideas off of us. So with that, thank you so much for having me today. This has been great.
All right, thanks so much, Natalie. We are going to move now to Dave Glenn with Holland and Hart. The first worksheet that we had out at the beginning on compliance might be good to have out again here. And we'll just dive right in. Dave, if you're ready.
Okay, I'm ready. Everyone can hear me okay? I guess so. Everyone's nodding. Okay. I have 20 minutes, very strictly sticking to that time, to talk about a topic that really is probably a lot bigger than 20 minutes. But the previous speakers have laid the groundwork here really well. So I'll go through this rather quickly at a really high level. Glad to take any questions and expound on any of this as questions arise right at the end. When we take questions, be glad to do that. So this is who I am. I practice solely in this area. We do have an office in Boise. It's one of our larger offices, and I'm up there every once in a while. So I'm glad to help you out if something does arise. Next slide, please. So I like to start out with the basics on the laws that affect international trade from the U.S. And the first thing I always start out with, is the export controls apply to all international trade. So be aware of that, even if you're not physically exporting, and I'll talk about that in a bit, even though this course is on exporting. Strict liability standard, just be aware of that these regulations, while you may not know you're breaking the law if you do something wrong, for example, export without a license that you're required to, that's still a violation. Now, the level of culpability is different, of course, and it'd be kind of hard to get you for a criminal offense if you didn't know you were breaking the law. But you still, if you export without a license, regardless of what you knew, you're liable. Understanding this regulatory scheme is really important, and I think that's why you're all here. And that next bullet I talk about, don't assume because you're not physically exporting something out of the U.S. That you're not, these laws don't kick in somehow. And they may or may not, depending on what you're doing. And some financial transactions that involve no physical export will also get captured by some of these, at least trade compliance laws that I'll talk about again. And then there was the great pitch on what a compliance program is. I won't really go into that, but taking the steps to protect your company, your entity before you start exporting is the best way to keep me out of your business, right? So I typically defend companies when things go wrong. I'd say a minority of the time I'm brought in before things go wrong, which I think is the right time to look at it. but that doesn't always happen. So looking at your compliance risk is the way to handle that and put a compliance program in place. So next slide. The regulatory environment, I'd like to mention this too, so that you understand where these regulatory laws are coming from, where the laws and regulations are coming from. Export controls, really the enforcement of export controls is based on kind of two-pronged policy, national security and foreign policy. So those elements are kind of, they're not clearly defined necessarily. I think we all kind of know what they mean in a general sense. But the way the government actually looks at these laws, it's very expansive. So you want to be careful that you are taking some steps to make sure that you have compliance steps or controls in place, because almost anything could fit into a national security or foreign policy argument, you know, if the government really wanted to push it. The risk of enforcement depends really on what's going on. So things like, you know, transactions with embargoed countries, if you're dealing with Cuba or Iran, we kind of know about them. But now there's some other countries that have other sanctions, you know, Venezuela and Russia. You know, some other countries that you wouldn't think necessarily would be restricted in some ways. You know, it all depends on what's happening kind of politically, as well as what's happening in the world, you know, geopolitically, I would say. And then again, having policies in place. That's the way to protect your company. Not a safe harbor, but certainly if I have to come in and help you after a violation, if you can show me that you have these compliance controls in place and you've thought about this at least, and you aren't just, you know, taking in orders and dropping them off FedEx and letting them take care of them, then I can defend the company a lot better. And the agencies really want to see that. Next slide. So with export controls, and I know there were a series of other programs, and probably some of this may have been covered, and I know we covered a little earlier in this program, but I'd like to kind of give you a little kind of a checklist, if you will, for things you need to look at when you start exporting. You need to know, obviously, what you're exporting. That's probably the easiest question, right? Because you have an order come in, you know what's been ordered, and you know how what your product is. Is it a service, though? Is it a physical item? Is it know-how? Technology, data. There are a lot of other categories besides a widget, a physical thing that you might export. You need to know who you're dealing with on the other end and where they're located. So it's really important that you not only look at, you know, saying, hey, I screen the countries, I know I'm not shipping to Cuba, so I know I'm good. Well, there are some other issues that you need to deal with in terms of who the party is that you're selling to and all the other parties involved. You need to know how the item is going to be used, the technology, the data, the physical item. How are they going to use it? Are they going to use it for some kind of proliferation? You know, will it be used in some kind of weapons development? Or is it going to be used in a general commercial, you know, application? And you may know that based on the type of product you have. But don't assume that just because in the US we use your product one way, that overseas in a particular country, they might not use it another way. And then how do you conduct business? I'll talk a little bit more about that a little later, but that's talking more about actually screening and, you know, going through, do you have contracts? Do you have purchase orders? Are you looking at terms? That kind of thing. And then can you demonstrate compliance? And what we like to say is we like to have some defensive data available that when something does happen, we can come in and say, yes, you know, we obviously we had a slip up, but we have controls in place. We did training. And we can kind of support that we're doing the right things. And that's really what, particularly the Commerce Department, I deal in both agencies, and I'll mention the regs in a bit here, but I deal with both agencies, State Department and Commerce, as well as the Department of Energy and Nuclear Regulatory Commission on the export control areas. And Commerce is very, I think, a helpful organization. However, they are an enforcement, they have an enforcement arm as well, so be aware of that. I put the equation down there at the bottom because it's often confusing when I start with new exporters to understand. They can look at their product and we can say we're going to classify the product, right? We're going to determine where it fits on the control list, and that's going to tell us everything we need to know, right? Well, not exactly. So that's one piece. That's one piece of the equation. We know where it's going. Is it going to an embargoed destination? Is it going to some other, sanctioned destination? We need to look at who's going to get the product. Who's the end user? What are they going to use it for? Are they a military? Are they affiliated with a foreign government? Are they research and development, and weapons? We need to know who the end user is and what they're going to do with it. And when you get all those elements together and answer all the questions, you can figure out if you need a license. First off, if you can do the transaction, if you need a license, or if you can just ship it as what we say, no license required. So next slide. And what's covered, this is important to realize that most people understand that an export is, a physical shipment outside the U.S. That's pretty simple. We all kind of learn that. It can be products, components, parts. It could, in the old days, it was software loaded on, CDs or disk or something, but, we don't do a whole lot of that anymore, I don't think. But it could be anything like that. It can be technology, something, the know-how to generally produce, develop, or use a product is what we're talking about on the commercial side with BIS. And that's a really difficult thing to pin down. I had a client today that was asking me a question about providing some marketing materials to a potential customer in Israel. And the product was pretty highly controlled. The technology on the other side, on the other hand, may or may not be as tightly controlled. You can't just assume if the product is, the technology is controlled, or the other way around. And things like marketing materials are not going to be, an issue. They're not going to be controlled. But when you get into how you use the product and how it's designed, we may end up into a technology area. I mentioned know-how. And then export and re-export. So the U.S. laws are kind of unique. Most countries have export controls, export regulations in place, but most of them do not have this little peculiar odd aspect of the U.S. controls that are extraterritorial. So when you export a product from the U.S., whether it's made in the U.S. or not, if it's coming physically from the U.S., that product is controlled wherever it goes in the world. So we call that a re-export. So an example would be you export your widget from Boise, it goes to France, and then the French customer decides, or maybe it's a distributor, decides, well, I need to ship it to Germany. That transaction from France to Germany is controlled under these U.S. export regulations, and we'll call that a re-export. It can happen with technology. We'll call it a retransfer. You transfer your technology to the person in France, and they send it to Germany. Now, it doesn't mean you need a license for that second leg, but the exporter may, or I should say the re-exporter may. I guess we're moving on to the next one. No, that's fine. Let's move on. I just want to make that point is that the re-export controls are in place for U.S. technology, not for many other countries, but definitely interesting that China is kind of trying to mirror our laws right now and put in an export regime that's very similar and that has an extraterritorial aspect to it. And I think it's in direct, response to what we do here in the U.S. and trying to compete, maybe, or at least keep up with us. So what else is covered under these laws, regulations? Some activities. I mentioned teaching or demonstrations. Now, I always get the question when I'm presenting this live, that always a hand goes up here and say, well, wait a minute, we have foreign nationals sitting in, my class here in Denver, and I'm teaching them. I'm teaching them, general, mathematical, theories and equations and things like that. Is that covered by the export controls? And generally that is not. Anything that's taught in a class that's in a catalog or in a university in the U.S. is not considered export control. However, if I take my let's see, it's some kind of missile, an engine for a missile, and I take it over to Europe, even a friendly country, I take it to the UK, and I start showing the Brits how to use this missile, this engine that's controlled, that demonstration may require a license. And we get those for clients. We've done that before, where we actually have to go out and get a license to actually demo the product or take it to even a trade show sometimes. Typically, that's not necessary if you keep it at a really high level. But when you start digging into the nuts and bolts of how it works, how it's designed, what's produced, we can end up in a licensable situation. Learning by visa holders, I'll talk about this in a minute. It's a very odd piece of U.S. law, I think. But visa holders are considered non-U.S. persons. So we consider actually conveying that information to a non-U.S. person if it's controlled, export controlled. We deem that to be an export to their home country. And I'll explain a little bit more about the deemed export rule, but it's a really odd piece of the law that, again, I don't think many countries buy into, and many countries have in their codes. but it is a part of the U.S. If you're getting into development, joint development, you're hiring maybe a really smart, great smart engineer from a university, local university that's not a U.S. person, that's not that is here on a visa. Those type of folks can get you into trouble if you have export controlled material that they would be exposed to. Next slide. And here's the deemed export rule in a little more detail, so you can kind of look at it. And you can read, when you divulge this information to any non-U.S. person, and again, it has to be export controlled. If I come and I have a foreign client, they come in and I say, here, I'll sell you my widget for, X dollars, and I give them a contract, and, there's no technical information in that. It's business, marketing, product specification type things, high level. None of that's controlled. But when I start, getting into technology that is controlled, then we have this deemed export rule where the government kind of deems that when you convey that information to a foreign person, it's deemed to be exported to their home country. Interestingly, it's deemed to be exported even if the person has no intention of returning. They have maybe no ties left. Maybe they were just born and say they were born in China and they were brought over as an infant. If they never became a U.S. citizen, of course. Then that's not, the intent there is not relevant, whether they're going to export it or not. And then just a little asterisk down there, I get asked that question a lot, what under these rules? This is only for export control purposes, not necessarily for other areas of law, but for export control and trade sanctions, the non-U.S. person is anyone in the U.S. on a visa. So any type of visa, it can be a student visa, an employment visa, a Canadian visa for someone coming in under USMCA now, I guess it is. Any of those kind of visas would be, you'd be considered non-U.S. person. If a dual citizen, and that comes up sometimes, so you're U.S. and another country, we treat you as a U.S. citizen, U.S. person. So you can be a dual, if this is possible, dual citizen of the U.S. and Cuba. I don't think it is, but for example, just as an example, if you were, we'd still treat you as a U.S. person. Next slide. Some special rules. I mentioned this on the re-exports and transshipments. U.S. origin technology remains controlled wherever it is in the world. If anyone that doesn't understand export controls or been around this area in a while or ever would probably wonder, how are we going to control this? Well, it's not real easy how the U.S. controls these re-export requirements. What happens typically in these cases, and I've been involved in several of them, is that the technology ends up, the item, the thing, ends up in a country it probably shouldn't be in, or to an end user that shouldn't have it. Say it's gone to China, it was licensed to customer X in China, but it ends up with customer Y. Customer Y is research and development for the government, and no authorization to go there. The U.S. government finds out about those things for various reasons. They do end-use checks. They go and look and see, you told me it was going to X, and now Y, where is it? Why it's not at X, it's at Y. They do those kind of checks. They also have tip lines and other reasons, other ways that they can actually determine that your product didn't end up where it was supposed to. So, or if there's a legitimate re-export that the foreign customer didn't get the license. And again, I've done those licenses for foreign companies. I have a client that does that regularly, and we will apply for a license for them in the U.S. to export, in this case, from the U.K. to New Zealand. And it's really an issue of sovereignty with many countries that they don't like to hear that this is how we do it. But it is part of the laws, and it is enforced. So we may need a license. And you may need a license because you export to a country. The initial export is no license required. We don't need to go get a license for that. But then that country, the individual in that country wants to export to a country that does require a license. And those get tricky. So you want to make sure that you understand, again, who you're dealing with on that end. And if it's a distributor, that they understand your product's going to be controlled if they export it out of that country. Sending through a country can equal to a country. It all depends on what we have to do is license typically to both. So in a license application, we will indicate that it's going, say, through the UK, but it's ending up in France, and that'll be authorized. Okay, next slide. Here are the regulations that we typically deal with. We have the Export Administration regulations from the Department of Commerce. and it's the Bureau of Industry and Security. Everything is controlled by BIS except defense articles, which is a term of art, defense articles, and those are controlled by this International Traffic in Arms Regulations under the State Department. And the office there, Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, DDTC, controls all defense articles. And not only the articles themselves, tanks, missiles, bombs, that kind of stuff, but also services. So we have many clients that don't actually make a product, but they provide services such as training. Training is considered if it's on a defense training of how to use a defense article or some kind of military training, that's considered a defense service. And if it's exported, it's under the authority of the State Department and the ITARs. Next slide. And then the other set of regulations that's going to impact any sort of international business, whether you export or not, a physical item or anything, is the Foreign Asset Control Regulations. And these are administered by OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Control, and they're in the Department of the Treasury. They are responsible to administer our sanctions and embargoes. So really important role. I would say last 4 years, we've seen, I think a lot of people know who OFAC is now, that didn't before. And, my job got a little more interesting in the last couple of years because we've used sanctions to such a great degree, and they're very important. But they will sanction not only, the embargoes that the country has set up, these sanctioned embargoes, which I'll talk to in a bit here, but there's several that are countries, Cuba and Iran, a few others. But also these individuals. So especially designated nationals and these other sanctioned parties, everything from drug traffickers, terrorists, to parties that are laundering money, that are doing other activities that are, somehow hinder our national security or foreign policy. And again, kind of broad range. But we're seeing daily that parties are getting added to these lists. And the lists are not all the same. Next slide. The list, and here's some of the acronyms for the list, but there's many. SDN is specially designated nationals, foreign sanctioned invaders. There's a lot of different lists that are out there, and not all by Treasury. Some of them are actually by Commerce Department, has an entity list, very important list. If you're exporting something that's subject to these EARs, the Export Administration Regulations, very important that you screen against the entity list. Fortunately, the government has a consolidated screening list that you can actually get. If you Google it, you can look into it, but it's also accessible off the BIS website. And you can go in and actually key into this screening tool, and it'll screen all the primary lists that you really need to look at. But there's a lot of them, very difficult to do manually if you try to do it. And if you have a lot of transactions, you set up a lot of new customers, you have a lot of different agents, a lot of different parties involved. It may be prohibitive, and the larger companies will set up software to actually do the screening. End use and end user, so don't forget the end user part of this, or rather the end use part of this. Many companies will actually ask for an end user certificate, which will indicate what the company plans, the customer plans to do with the item. Country destination is probably the easier one, right? You know where your product's going. You're going to tell the freight forwarder, take it to this country, this location. That's not that hard to screen, as long as it doesn't get diverted, right? Next slide. So those top four, and again, when I'm live, I like to ask people, if they can identify these flags, but those are the comprehensively sanctioned countries that we have here. First one, we've got Iran, Cuba, North Korea, and Syria. Other ones that are pretty comprehensively embargoed. The ones below are they're I should say, they're not comprehensive. They're limited sanctions. Like Russia, there's sanctions on Russia and particularly Crimea region of Ukraine for the annexation that Russia did. So there's those kind of sanctions. Venezuela is very tightly controlled. So there are other controls that are coming in. We've got Sudan had been removed from the sanctions programs. So there's individual parties, but not really the country anymore. So these sanctions change, the programs change, other than, say, Cuba, which has been around since, the 60s. Everyone knows about the Cuban embargo. the Trump administration cracked down even further on it. We don't know yet whether Biden will do the same, stick with that, or if he's going to loosen like the Obama administration did. But for right now, most activity with Cuba is off limits, but there are some exceptions. Next slide. And I mentioned that with the embargoed countries, any sort of transaction, something as harmless as a stapler, or, a pencil, would need a license to go to a country like Cuba or Iran. So it's really important if your product is a little more complicated and a little more sensitive, like modal valves. I mentioned the valves because they're not only good, they're used in food processing and other really commercial applications. It can also be used, they're very effective in environments that require anti-corrosion, such as chemical weapons. So the government controls them really tightly, and you wouldn't necessarily think that. I had a client that did that kind of product and exported without a license and ended up, running into a voluntary self-disclosure we talked earlier. Very important to use that methodology. Career enhancing because these cases, they get a lot of publicity within the agency and outside. If your company is caught and it's a large type of violation, they will write up a summary, press release and highlight your company in an area you probably don't want to have the publicity in. Arms embargo countries, there are a bunch of those that you cannot ship any sort of defense article to without a license and policy of denial, so you won't get a license. The one big one is China. We cannot ship any arms to China, so if your company has anything that would fall under the ITAR, please make sure you don't do any activity with China. Next slide. And then controls on how business operate. I mentioned the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. That's the Anti-Bribery Act. The United States' Anti-Bribery Act just prohibits bribing foreign government officials for any sort of advantage. And it could be any sort of item of value. It doesn't have to be money. It could be other aspects, things like, use of a vacation home or paying for travel expenses to go to Disney World or things like that. It could be anything other than a pure cash payment that you'd think of normally as a bribe. I won't get into that, but I want to mention that that's another area that's controlled, in international dealings. Anti-boycott is under the Department of Commerce, and that's really a regulation that says that the U.S., anyone in the U.S. is not allowed to comply with a foreign boycott if it's not sanctioned, if it's not one of these comprehensively embargoed countries. So you need to report when you receive those requests. And that's about all I'll say about that, but it's another area it's actually in the Export Administration regulations. Next slide. I think that might be it. That is it. Okay. Sorry for racing through that, but I think I made my 20 minutes hopefully, and I will take questions when we're ready.
Perfect. Oh, yes, I am going to stop sharing for a second here. All right. So I know Matt from HMI and Trish McCarthy, if either of you wanted to give a little bit of testimony on some of your experiences.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Trish McCarthy. Good to see you again. I've had the pleasure of coming, I think, to all 4 of these sessions, and I just want to say hats off to the Department of Commerce. You guys have done a great job. And I'll mention a couple observations, especially on the international payment terms and how to navigate letters of credit or getting money from other countries, because my background includes 16 years of international banking experience and 20 in export credit and political risk insurance. But what I want to say especially is I'm sitting in these webinars thinking there's so much information. There's so much coming at us, and how can all of us, give you all of our experience and wisdom in 20 minutes? The main takeaway is Idaho really is rich with resources, and people that are already in the international trade game love to share information. It's like just part of, being the kind of professional that if we're in international and export space, we like to teach others. So just take away from all of these sessions, the people you're meeting at the Department of Commerce and Idaho State's Export Assistance Centers, expediters last month, what Dave's sharing, what Natalie's sharing, because not everything has to be taken in at once. And to the topic of international payments, it's great if you can get cash in advance. Cash is king. It doesn't absolve you from doing some homework all the time, like Dave is pointing out, or, you know, just the basic rule of business, know who you're dealing with. And then as we go outside the country, know how to deal in that space. We're so spoiled in the US because we can ship goods across the country and have UCC filings and normal things we're just used to. But once you get into other countries, there are all these other rules, but there's a lot of knowledgeable people. International payment methods, banks that have international departments, people that can help you through, should I use a letter of credit? How do I give my buyer instructions on wiring the money to me so I get it quickly, efficiently, and without too many fees taken away? Should I invoice in foreign currency? Talk to your bankers. Have them help you understand the process. Or if their bank doesn't have the expertise, come to the Department of Commerce, because there's lots of us in the community waiting to be found to help walk you through it. So as Natalie said, cash in advance if you can get it, letter of credit if it makes sense, if your product warrants the expense and sometimes cumbersomeness of a letter of credit. If they're small ticket items or you've been dealing with your buyer for a long time, maybe you want to be a little bit more flexible than cash in advance. Maybe you do 50% in advance, open account on the other half. My product is export credit insurance. So that is insurance you can buy to mitigate non-payment of an invoice where you've decided to extend open account terms. The insurance policy and getting it approved helps take you through the process of knowing your buyer. Are they credit worthy? Do they have the financial wherewithal? If they don't want to give you a letter of credit, maybe it's because they can't afford to. So talking through this with the different people you're meeting in these webinars, and Sharon and Sarah, I appreciate that you actually create a conference room kind of atmosphere where people can see each other's names and talk to each other, because that's the benefit of networking. And although COVID has taken that away from us, same thing, I guess, if you're starting to go overseas, you can meet your potential buyer overseas through these screens, and then having Department of Commerce and U.S. Department of Commerce or the state help you do the due diligence. So I didn't want to get on too much of a broad tangent, but there's so much coming at you, but a lot of local expertise that want to handhold you. So I'm enjoying, as a new person to Idaho, getting to know all these resources. So thanks for letting me comment, Sharon.
You bet. Thanks for joining, Trish. You've been great to have on all of them. How you doing, Matt? You ready?
I am. I just have a couple things. I think Trish said a lot of, provided a lot of good information too, and I think I would definitely say that there's a lot of value in really knowing who you're dealing with and who you're going to export with, and don't assume that your partners were going to know all the regulations in their own country. So when you get ready to start moving your products out, make sure that you know what sort of regulations are going to affect your products, what sort of tariffs. Make sure you double check your harmonized codes, because they're going to ask for that. If they have any other product information like your SDSs, like your standard safety data sheets, if you need to send those along, be prepared to send those well in advance, and try not to, if you have to make those up and you've already sent your product and it's waiting in customs, then it can be extremely stressful for you and your client. So just a couple case studies I had that I can talk about. I was at a trade show in Dubai, and had a gentleman come up to us, and he was looking at some equipment that we distribute from the United States and wanted to buy some of our products. And he had an office based out of Turkey. And so we started discussing you know, some of the logistics of getting the products over there, a little bit about pricing, and he sounded excited. And then he had mentioned that it didn't really matter about the project so much in Turkey because he was going to be forwarding the material onto Iran, and which immediately should raise red flags for you if there's going to be a re-export anywhere along the line, because then I had to basically cut the conversation short and say, unfortunately, we can't do business because you just told me that you're going to resell this material into a country that we have sanctions against. And so there are some very real consequences if you decide, or if you have if you're being put in those situations and you don't understand where those products might be going in the future. Saying interesting to know about trade agreements as well. So if you're trying to sell products in, let's say, Brazil, and they have extremely large tariffs, you may not be nearly as competitive in that country. So maybe don't spend so much time on planning how your market expansion is going to go before you understand how tariffs are going to impact your products once they arrive. So yeah, trade agreements are important. So harmonized codes and understanding what code will fit to your product. And then if it's really your first time exporting, I probably would recommend getting a broker for a market, or if it's a very difficult market, then look for a broker that would kind of help you move through some of the climate that you've never experienced in that country. And I think the Department of Commerce and Commercial Services can kind of help with that as well. Let's see if there's something else. So we usually use XM Bank. Great to have if you're communicating with clients and certain, that want some sort of terms. And that's nice to have, to be able to at least offer that. But sure, yeah, there's like a lot of different types of regulations depending on your products. And Australia, for example, if you're in the ag industry, they have pretty tight restrictions and licensing stuff, and you may be able to send your products over to Australia, and if they don't, even if they don't meet, you may get the license to ship, but it may actually not meet the requirements once it's on the ground. So there may be further treatments, like let's say if you ship an ag product that has weeds in it or seeds, then that will have to be treated before it can be released, and it's a very expensive process, or all of the material will just have to be basically incinerated. So yeah, really understand where you're going, what you're doing, and there's always help out there. Just know that it's great to be able to export products, and it's great to have that international market, but just try to understand what how you're going to do it the best you can, and the Department of Commerce can help you through that. So
perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I love your Dubai to Turkey to Iran story. So always a good lesson there for companies. So do we have any questions for any of the speakers or any other companies that want to share any stories? We are just about wrapped up on our webinar here. Pretty quiet group today.
Sharon, one thing I might mention on the Dubai Turkey issue, the Commerce Bureau, all the agencies, Commerce I mentioned has an enforcement arm. So they have the officers that carry guns and, come in and enforce these laws. But you don't necessarily have to have that direct knowledge to be in, a situation like that. Obviously, in Matt's case, they told him, hey, we're going to do this. But sometimes there's other indicators, and oftentimes it'll happen after the export. And just a word of warning that the company may receive the information that your product's been re-exported or diverted after the fact. So you've delivered it to end user A in a country, and then, a month later, you get a warranty card, or you get a call for servicing someone in, say, Iran or Cuba. And you wonder, well, we didn't send it to Iran, we didn't send it to Cuba, we don't have any customers there. and you find out that, there's this, and I have had a client in this situation as well, a distributor, particularly in the Middle East and Dubai and the UAE, those countries that do trade freely with Iran, the products end up there. And that's an issue if you, once that's happened, you didn't know at the time you exported, you had no knowledge, there isn't really a violation there. But once you go ahead and start to service that particular product or offer any sort of support, you've committed a violation of the Export Administration Regulations. So be very careful, as well as probably the OFAC sanctions. So be very careful on that. If the company learns, and it's oftentimes it'll happen through customer service or warranty support, it doesn't go to the compliance people necessarily. And the government just imputes that knowledge to the entire company. So just be aware of that situation. It's better when they come up and tell you right up front. But it doesn't always happen that way, and be very careful. There is a what we call a general prohibition that doesn't allow you to go ahead and proceed with the transaction if you know there's going to be a violation, and that would be one. So just a quick comment on that.
No, great information, Dave. Thank you. All right. Does anyone else have any questions today? I can't unmute you, Sarah. There you go.
No other questions?
I was just going to add one thing I noticed with Dave's presentation when we talked about deemed exports and how it's people within the U.S. on any sort of visa. I did just want to make a note that it's if you have a green card, so a permanent resident visa, that person is also not considered a deemed export, so that they're treated like the U.S. citizen would be or a dual citizen would be. And just want to reemphasize the importance of knowing what you're doing and going through this. And this is a great presentation. You guys have done a fabulous job on it. And the BIS does consider having an export compliance program as a mitigating factor. So if you do mess it up, and you do accidentally do something and you need to go through that voluntary compliance or disclosure process, being able to show that you do have evidence of that you've been trying to do the right thing and you've been training your employees and you do have the written procedures in place, those things really do help to mitigate what your potential violation and liability could be. So rely on the experts to help if you need it. Like I said, there's a lot of resources you guys have put out there. I'm happy to assist as well for those that need it, and the Commerce Department has my information. So just, you guys are doing a great job.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And it is true. Trish's statement of the export community in Idaho is relatively small still. I met people 10 years ago when I started exporting with a small company here in Idaho, just a mom and pop shop, and they're still all the same players, and that's what brought me to commerce and why I love helping small companies, just because the realization of, wow, where it could take you when you really are just a really small hometown Idaho company is pretty amazing. So feel free to reach out. Everybody kind of knows everybody still. Idaho's growing, but it's still relatively small. So if anyone has any questions, you have Sarah and my information, and we will just all be in touch soon. Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you everyone so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.